Moonlight gashes the tree line like a silver blade. A Dogman platoon fans out in a staggered wedge, eyes ember bright, breath fogging like steam from a furnace across the ravine. Werewolves crack their bones like loading rifles, fingers erupt into talons, teeth cascade like shrapnel through blood-wet gums, and then every shadow freezes. A third howl, not feral, not maddened, commanding. Lycans step from the ruin of a chapel wearing ritual scars in steel, half man, half wolf, all discipline. Swords whisper from sheaths. A silver ink sigil blazes to life on the lead Lycan's chest. Tonight the forest is not a place, it is an altar, whispering narratives. We don't tell stories, we open doors you can't close. The blood moon wobbles, heavy as a heart about to burst. The hill quakes, old stone splits. Something vast and hungry flexes beneath the battlefield. Tasting the three curses at once, the Dogmen snarl, the werewolves roar. The Lycans raise blades in a silent vow. The war does not begin with a charge. It begins with a scream you feel in your teeth. Prophecy said when the three bloodlines bled under one moon, one would ascend, and the rest would be erased. The valley had a name once, the maps forgot it first. Then the hunters, then the wolves. Names rot when a place decides you don't deserve to speak it. By dusk, fog hung low and sullen over the hemlocks, and the ground was fat with the summer's rain. Soft enough to remember every pore, every boot, every body that would kneel before the night. The first to arrive were the Dogmen, rangy, barrel-chested things with shoulders like battering rams and ears that twitched at the whisper of a trigger reset. They moved like they'd been drilled by a sergeant with a silver tongue and a mean right hook. Formations blossomed and tightened. 2 forward scouts, 3 on overwatch, Alpha at the hinge point. They didn't howl, they calculated, across the ravine. As the sun bled out behind the ridge, men started to come apart, not by choice, by sentence. The curse has a sound before it has a shape. Cartilage rolling like dice, ribs cinching, a hush before tendon snaps. Jackets gave way to fur, cheekbones pushed out into jaws. Fingers lost the argument with nature when the werewolves stood. They were hunger-shaped like a verdict. They did not deploy. They surged. They believed the fastest path to victory was through flesh, preferably yours. And then the third faction, last to step into the open, first to be feared Lycans, not the accident of a bite, nor the feral math of the Dogman gene. Chosen, initiated, bound to a code older than the churches that called them devils, and older still than the tribes that made monuments to moons. They came with blades and breath control and a patience that could ruin kings. 12 at first. The shock of their presence enough to make both packs shift their weight and pretend it wasn't fear. You could hear the valley thinking about them. I was on the ridge with a glass and an old rifle that had no business pretending it mattered. The glass told me the things my heart didn't want to know. This wasn't a skirmish over territory or prey. This was a ritual that needed witnesses. And I was the only idiot who hadn't learned to close his eyes. Someone beside me, the kind of someone who never arrived by accident, clicked open a silver clasp on a leather folio and handed me a page. The paper smelled like libraries and storms. The ink was brown where it should have been black. When the blood moon calls 3 curses to the same altar, the earth will choose an heir. I laughed because that's what you do when your bones start to vibrate. Choose an heir sounds civilized until you realize what it means in the grammar of monsters. It means 2 bloodlines become echoes and 1 becomes law on the field. The Dogmen executed their doctrine, pinch the ravine on the high ground, drive the wolves into a funnel, let rage do the thinning. They placed their fast movers in the ferns and their thick necks on the rock. You could see the calculation in their amber eyes. Werewolves are chaos. So build them a maze and watch them bruise themselves to death on the walls. But rage writes its own maps. The werewolves didn't read the funnel. They broke it. The first charge wasn't a line. It was a wave, a tearing, a choir of bone noise. 1 wolf went down under a Dogman's bite. Collarbone split like a twig. But 3 more piled in, and for a heartbeat the forest was nothing but breathing and tearing and wet heavy thumps of bodies finding the floor. The Lycans did not move. That's how you knew they were dangerous. Discipline is a blade that cuts slow and forever. Their front rank lowered swords until the tips kissed the mud. Their commander, scar-inked sigils crossing the clavicles, eyes like coins minted in moonlight, closed his fist. Every Lycan's chest rose at the same pace, a tide locked to some internal metronome. When he opened his hand, it looked like a blessing. It felt like a sentence. The wind turned, the valley tasted metal, and for a moment, just one, every breath, human or not, hitched like the air itself was too thick to swallow. Under the hemlocks, prayer bands knocked against my wrist. A charm maker in the valley town sold them to drunks and hunters, and anyone else with an ache they called superstition. Braided cords worked with silver dust and a splinter of iron. It wouldn't stop a claw, maybe it would make the claw hesitate. Sometimes that's enough time to remember your children's names. On the field, Dogman tactics started to bite. They got a flank to buckle, and they shoved werewolves into the ravine where mud climbed calves and panic climbed throats. That's when the wolves' madness did something that wasn't madness at all. It adapted. A grey with a face like a shattered idol rammed his own shoulder into the ravine wall, collapsed wet clay into the Dogman's firing lane, and howled low, not for courage, for coordination. The pack pivoted. Teeth found hamstrings, claws found wrists. A wedge of dogmen peeled back, and for the first time the alpha dog's ears twitched with doubt. The Lycan stepped, not far, not fast, but the kind of step that tells everyone watching the rules just changed. Swords slid free and silver found the moon. If the werewolves were storm, and the dogmen were industry, the Lycans were surgery. Cold, precise, sure of what needs cutting and what needs to be left alone to hurt later. I pressed my eye to the glass and found the Lycan commander's face. He was not beautiful. Beauty takes softness, he had none. But there was a gravity to him that made the rest look like things orbiting a decision they didn't make. He turned, not to the battlefield, but to the ridge, toward me. Toward the gun that didn't matter. Toward the prayer bands knocking against each other like teeth. He lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a gesture I didn't recognize and returned his gaze to the altar of mud and blood. Below, the first 3-way contact happened like lightning deciding it's tired of the sky. A dogman lunged at a wolf's spine. A Lycan's blade answered. The wolf's jaw closed on the dogman's calf. The dogman's claws chewed through the Lycan's forearm guard. The Lycan drove the pommel into the wolf's temple, and all of them bled for the moon that had stopped pretending it was a rock and started acting like a judge. If you've never heard 3 types of howls braid into one, count yourself loved by God. It's a sound that lets you measure your courage by how long you keep your feet. I sat. It wasn't piety, it was survival. The folio man spoke finally. You think this is chaos? It isn't, it's a ballot. Ballots have choices, I said. This looks like a decision already made. He shook his head. The earth is old, it takes its time. The blood has to agree. On the field, a werewolf slammed a dogman so hard into a pine that bark became shrapnel. A Lycan severed the wolf's hamstring and caught him before he fell, lowering him like a brother or a rival or a sacrifice, then opening the throat with a tenderness that made me sick. Ritual scars lit across the Lycan's chest in silver. He whispered something no one survived long enough to repeat. The ground knocked, not a quake, a knuckle rap from under the table. Dirt domed and settled, domed and settled. Something below wanted above, if war is a ladder. The valley had just revealed a snake coiled through the rungs. Even monsters know dread. The dogman's ears went back. A wolf stopped mid-lunge, saliva hanging in a glass thread from his fang. The Lycan commander looked down as if remembering an appointment he never wanted to keep. The folio man closed the clasp. When the 3 are one, I read it. I said, 1 ascends. He nodded. You didn't read the margin. They never do. He held the page to the moon. In the slanted light, a palimpsest bled through. Older ink, meaner hand, and the hunger that birthed them all wakes to take its child's throne. Below, the ravine seam split a second time. The moon felt closer, heavier, swollen with blood it hadn't shed yet. The first scream came from a dogman who thought he'd seen every nightmare his ancestors had collected on their way through the centuries. The second from a wolf who didn't have words left for fear, just the kind of keening you make when your gods return and they aren't kind. The third from a Lycan who didn't scream so much as pronounce the syllable that lifts a blade and ends wars by starting a worse one. I put my palm on the mud. It was warm. The valley remembered its name then. But not in any language you could fit on a sign. It said, Altar and the night, polite as a priest, asked for the first offering. The valley became geometry. Not the kind you drew on chalkboards. This was teeth and angles, blood and mathematics of murder. The dogmen drew lines first. They were always the tacticians, flanking arcs bent like iron jaws, reserves dug into the hillside like ticks waiting for the skin to thin. Their alpha, broad snout scarred into a permanent sneer, stalked the rear line, snapping orders like a general who'd learned war from centuries of ambushes. Every twitch of his ear was a semaphore. Every growl a command. The werewolves answered with entropy. They didn't believe in lines, they believed in flood when they charged. It wasn't formation, it was a fever dream, a mass of fur, claws, and hunger that didn't break like waves but like avalanches. Every howl was both battle cry and curse. Their alphas were less commanders than detonators, their shrieks ripping across the field to trigger frenzy in every cursed vein. When the two fronts collided, the air itself snapped like glass under too much heat. Dogman claws punched through ribs, wolves' jaws cracked femurs. The forest turned into a charnel house of wet splinters and bone shrapnel. But the Lycans, oh the Lycans, they waited, watching every step measured, every blade catching moonlight like it was part of the ceremony. They weren't soldiers or berserkers, they were executioners. They chose their targets like priests choosing sacrifices. When a dogman squad overextended, 3 Lycans cut the throat of the formation, decapitating it in seconds. When a werewolf alpha got carried away with bloodlust, a Lycan sword parted his spine from skull to tail. And then, just as the battlefield found its rhythm, the ground reminded everyone it still had a say. A pulse, not thunder, not quake, a heartbeat. It came from the ravine floor, spreading through the mud like ripples on dark water. Dogmen froze mid-claw swipe, wolves' hackles spiked. Lycans tilted their heads as if listening to a prayer none of the others understood. Prophecy was speaking and none of them liked its grammar. Suspense on the ridge. I should have left. I should have run when the first howl braided with the second. But humans have a sickness called curiosity. We can't stop staring at the knife that's about to cut us. My glass caught every nightmare in that valley, magnified it, pressed it against my eye until I forgot the world was supposed to have mornings. I watched a dogman alpha throw a werewolf down like a rag doll, only for the wolf's claws to carve his throat, even as his own lungs filled with blood. Both died, neither surrendering their grip nearby. A Lycan swung his blade so clean it parted a wolf's head without disturbing the twitching body. He whispered a word over the corpse, silver scars on his chest glowing faintly as if the kill itself had been an offering. They weren't just killing each other, they were keeping score. Every death was a vote, the ballot of blood. The horror mounts, the ravine split wider. Mud sloughed into the dark, something below it exhaled, and the mist carried the stench of things buried before men invented calendars. Even the predators gagged. The dogman alpha barked commands, desperate to hold formation, but his ears twitched with unease. Werewolves didn't slow. Rage was a current they couldn't swim against. But their howls started to bend, pitch cracked by fear they didn't understand. The Lycans. They knelt, every last one of them. Blades point down, heads bowed to the earth. And that terrified me more than all the violence. They weren't kneeling to pray, they were kneeling to welcome. The folio man's words echoed in my skull. The hunger that birthed them all wakes. The blood moon swelled overhead, dripping crimson light into the fog like dye into water. Every drop made the valley darker, and from the pit below the heartbeat quickened. 1, 2, 3, and with the 4th, the war forgot strategy. It became pure survival. The battlefield is now a feeding frenzy, with an ancient force pressing against the soil. The war should have been simple. Claws against claws, teeth against teeth. Dogman strategy strangling werewolf chaos. While Lycans cut the throat of both, that's how it should have gone. But the moon was no bystander, it was a judge. The moonlight turns, redder at first. It was subtle, a tint in the fog, a sheen across the blood pooling between roots. But then the sky split open. The moon wept light, not silver but scarlet, so thick it looked like blood dripped through the clouds themselves. The battlefield was no longer dark. It was a cathedral lit by gore, and the ground's heartbeat grew faster. Thump, thump, thump. Each pulse made the trees sway, though no wind moved. Each pulse rattled my bones like I was a drum meant for someone else's music. The warriors felt it too. Dogmen froze in mid-charge, their formations fraying as their ears twitched toward the earth. Werewolves snapped out of frenzy long enough to whimper like dogs that had suddenly remembered they were prey. Even Lycans broke posture, blades trembling as their commander lowered his sword and looked at the moon like a son, recognizing a father he thought long dead. A war measured in deaths, every kill became louder. When a dogman ripped open a werewolf's ribcage, the heartbeat in the ground doubled its pace. When a Lycan severed a dogman's spine, the moon bled darker. Every death was no longer subtraction, it was addition. The field wasn't emptying, it was filling. I realized then the war wasn't about dominance. It was about tally. The moon was keeping score, and the earth was feeding on the math. The folio man whispered without opening his mouth, his voice crawling into my ear like a parasite. Every throat torn is a ballot. Every heart stopped is a signature when the last vote is cast. One bloodline inherits the night. I asked him which one. He smiled with teeth that weren't his own, the one that doesn't beg. Suspense tightens on the field. Suspense turned into madness. Dogmen snapped their own kind's necks just to stack votes faster. Werewolves turned on packmates in frenzied paranoia. Every bite a desperate bid for survival through annihilation. Lycans, more disciplined, began counting aloud in their native tongue each time they killed. Numbers etched into the fog like tally marks carved in bone. The moon pulsed brighter with every count, throbbing like an artery stretched across the sky. I thought it would burst and spill its blood onto the earth. The ground cracked again, not just mud this time. Stone shattered, roots split, and something vast shifted below. The stench rose stronger. Iron, rot, and a musk older than mammal skin. The prophecy bends, the folio page fluttered in my hand as if alive. The margin I hadn't read glowed faintly, revealing words the ink hadn't shown before. When the tally is near its end, the blood moon will open its eye. The one who ascends is not who fights the hardest, but who feeds the hunger best. I dropped the page, the mud swallowed it whole. The horror grows on the battlefield. The first true horror surfaced, a dogman tore into a wolf, only for the wound not to bleed but to hiss, steam rising, smoke curling. The corpse buckled, spasmed, then moved again, not as wolf, not as dogman, not as anything that belonged to either bloodline. The thing rose crooked, eyes glowing black, not gold or silver. The vote had been counted, and the battlefield was collecting its harvest. Both sides froze, even the Lycans faltered. For the first time that night, no one advanced. All three armies stared at the thing their war had birthed. And for a single heartbeat, monsters knew fear. The blood moon has started choosing, and it's corrupting the dead into something worse. The valley should have been slick with silence by now, a graveyard sealed under fog and moonlight. But silence never came. The blood moon pulsed like a wound refusing to clot, and the earth throbbed louder, faster, like something beneath it had finally smelled enough death to rise. The first to rise, it began with the dogman. His throat had been torn open minutes before. His chest cavity gnawed until ribs glistened like ivory fangs. He should have been a feast for crows. Instead, he twitched. Once, twice. Then he rose on joints that cracked backward, like a puppet reassembled wrong. His eyes weren't amber anymore. They were voids. Black wells where hunger didn't reflect light. It swallowed it. The werewolf that had killed him staggered back. Hackles high, tail stiff with animal panic. He had seen prey. Rivals, hunters, never this. The corpse lunged, faster than anything that should still be rotting. And when its claws sank into the wolf's chest, the moon howled for both. That wolf didn't die. He changed, his fur dulled to ash. His eyes guttered like coals drowned in oil. And when he snapped his teeth, they clinked like iron striking iron. The curse was no longer bloodline, it was plague. Suspense shifts into terror. The dogmen shrieked, abandoning doctrine. Their formations unraveling as the corpses of their own kin turned on them. The werewolves, blind with rage, tried to fight, but every kill only bred another abomination. Claws that tore flesh gave rise to black-eyed mockeries of both. The Lycans alone seemed to understand. Their commander barked words not in rage but in ritual, his scars glowing silver as he cut down both living and risen. To them, it wasn't war anymore. It was exorcism. They moved with grim precision, severing heads, cauterizing wounds with silver-laced blades, chanting words that bent the fog itself. Yet even they faltered as the dead multiplied faster than steel could answer. The battlefield was no longer 3 armies. It was 4, the folio's warning on the ridge. The folio man spoke without looking at me. The dead do not serve. They collect, they bind, they erase. He opened the leather folio again, revealing lines I swore hadn't been there. The parchment rippled, as though ink was sweating through it fresh. The war is not to crown a victor, it is to thin the herd. The hunger wakes not to choose, but to consume. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the valley below argued louder. The battlefield collapses. Dogman generals, once barking orders, were now barking screams as their own soldiers fell upon them. Werewolves in frenzy ripped apart corpses that would not die, only to be dragged down and reshaped into black-eyed beasts themselves. Lycans fought in narrowing circles, chanting louder, their voices hoarse, blades flashing like lightning against a tide that would not recede. The suspense was unbearable. Every heartbeat from the ground was quicker, louder until it felt like my own chest was sinking with it. The battlefield wasn't fighting anymore, it was being harvested. The horror realized the corrupted corpses didn't howl, they didn't roar, they hummed, a low, deep sound that vibrated through mud and marrow alike, drowning out commands, drowning out prayers, drowning out sanity. Every soldier, Dogman, Werewolf, Lycan, clutched their heads as the hum thickened, and the blood moon swelled grotesque, a bloated lantern above an earth that demanded more. And then the ravine cracked open fully. The hum stopped, the corpses froze, heads turning in unison toward the pit. Something had finally answered. The ravine did not widen, it peeled, stone and root tore apart like wet parchment, layers of earth curling back as though the ground itself had been only a scab. From the wound came breath, not wind, breath hot, damp, rank with centuries of soil, rot and marrow ground into paste. The birth of the hunger claw emerged first. Not a wolf's, not a dog's, not even a Lycan's. It was older, longer than a tree trunk. Black as coal left to drown in tar, it dragged trenches through the mud, pulling something vast and patient into the world. When its hand closed, the corpses bent their knees like worshippers. Then came the head. No snout, no ears, just a skull stretched impossibly long, fanged like 100 wolves pressed into one. Its eyes were not fire nor void, but mirrors, reflecting every face on the battlefield, as though each soldier stared into their own death. The folio man whispered, "Behold the parent, the 3 armies." Break Dogman snapped. Their discipline cracked like ice under a boot. They turned and ran, scattering into the forest, but the parent's breath dragged them back, their legs buckling as if the air itself was too heavy to escape. The werewolves fared no better. Rage couldn't find a target this size. They clawed at the parent's limbs, only to be brushed aside like gnats, bones exploding beneath casual swipes. Their howls rose higher than the moon itself, but even fury bends before inevitability. The Lycans, to their credit, did not run. Their commander planted his blade into the earth, scars flaring like white fire, chanting louder, until his chest smoked with the heat of burning silver. His soldiers followed, their voices weaving into a dirge. For a moment, just one, the parent paused, as if respecting the ritual, but hunger does not respect. It devours. Suspense knives. In the parent spoke, not in words, but in vibration. The hum that had guided the corpses deepened into a single pulse that rattled teeth and skulls. It was not language, yet every soul heard the same truth. "You are not my heirs. You are my ingredients." The corpses surged at the command, falling upon the living with renewed violence. Dogmen screamed as their throats were torn and their blood sizzled in the mud. Werewolves snapped their jaws shut on nothing but smoke as corpses dissipated and reformed behind them. Lycans carved black-eyed husks apart, only to watch their numbers multiply again. Every kill was no longer subtraction, it was multiplication. The folio's revelation. The man beside me opened the folio one last time. The parchment writhed, letters burning new lines into its flesh. The parent does not choose a victor. It makes a feast, and when the feast is full, it climbs from the altar to the throne. I tore my eyes from the battlefield and looked at him. His smile was wider now, too wide. His teeth were not human anymore. "Who are you?" I asked, his grin cut deeper. "The scribe of your extinction." The horror becomes cosmic. The parent rose higher, dragging its torso from the ravine, ribs snapping open like prison bars, releasing every nightmare at once. Within its chest hung not organs but moons, 3 of them, pale, crimson and black, each dripping light like blood. Every warrior froze, unable to move as the moons swayed like pendulums. And the parent's voice pulsed again. One bloodline will remain. Not as victor, as cattle, the battlefield. Once war became judgment. The pit has opened, the parent has risen. And now survival is no longer between factions. It's against extinction. The parent's ribs yawned wider. Moons swaying like lanterns in a butcher's hall. Every eye on the battlefield. Dogman, werewolf, Lycan. Even the dead, locked onto those pendulums. You couldn't look away. They weren't just moons, they were choices. The breaking point, the Dogman alpha, throat bloodied but not broken, snapped his fangs into the shoulder of a retreating packmate to steady him. His ears twitched, scanning the battlefield, not for prey, not for flanks, but for any rhythm that wasn't the parent's heartbeat. He found none. His cunning had kept his kind alive for centuries. Tonight it told him the truth. Discipline means nothing if the world itself wants you gone. The werewolf alpha howled, his voice ragged, not commanding but pleading. His pack's frenzy had chewed itself into exhaustion. Now they circled tight, hackles high, eyes wide with the kind of terror only wolves know when the shadow is too big to fight. Rage had been their god, but rage could not fill the shape of the parent. The Lycans stood blood-soaked but upright, their chants fractured. Their commander coughing silver onto the mud. His ritual scars flickered dimmer with every breath. He looked from wolves to dogmen and finally, reluctantly, nodded once, a gesture older than alliances. A truce born not of mercy, but of mathematics. The first pact it began brutally. A dogman tried to rip out a wolf's throat, old hatred still too loud. The Lycan commander stepped between them, his blade at the dogman's chest, his eyes daring him to defy extinction. The wolf snarled, saliva dripping onto the steel, but did not strike. The three alphas, scarred dogman, frothing werewolf, silver-lit Lycan, formed a triangle beneath the blood moon. They did not speak the same language. They didn't need to. Their bodies said it all. If we don't fight together, there will be no one left to fight at all. And so the pact was sealed. Not with words, but with violence redirected, suspense coils tighter. The parent sensed it. The moons inside its ribcage swayed harder, dripping streams of liquid light into the corpses below. The dead roared in unison, their black eyes flaring, surging toward the living like a tide of claws and teeth. But this time the tide met a wall. Dogmen slammed into the horde shoulder first, their military precision forming a phalanx of claws and muscle. Werewolves barreled behind. Raw rage turned into blunt force shock troops, tearing gaps wide. Lycans threaded between both, blades flashing, every strike severing tendons, carving paths through the swarm. For the first time that night, the living stopped retreating. The pact in action, it was ugly. Allies tore into each other as often as into the risen, but necessity bent hatred into a weapon. Dogmen hauled fallen wolves back to their feet instead of finishing them. Werewolves shielded Lycans with their bulk, taking wounds they'd never have tolerated hours ago. Lycans drove their blades into anything that faltered, whether foe or friend, because hesitation was death. They fought not as brothers, but as survivors clawing against the maw of something that wanted them erased. A whisper of hope from the ridge, I felt it, a subtle shift. The heartbeat in the ground stuttered. Just once, a skipped beat. The parent was vast. But even vast things can bleed. The folio man snapped his head toward the pit, eyes wide with something I'd never expected, fear. His smile cracked, and for the first time, he looked mortal. He whispered almost to himself, they weren't supposed to unite. The horror of the pact hope is not free. Every alliance came at cost. Wolves tore themselves apart to hold lines. Dogmen fought with their backs broken, their discipline unraveling into sacrificial stands. Lycans bled silver until their scars dimmed, but still they swung, chanting through blood-choked throats. The parent did not fall, but it slowed. Its claws scraped harder, its ribs heaved faster, and its moons swayed less like pendulums and more like chains being tugged. The pact had drawn blood, not enough, but enough to matter. The three bloodlines are fighting together. For the first and last time, the parent feels it, and it will not tolerate defiance. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a furnace, and every creature inside burned. Dogmen, werewolves, and Lycans carved side by side. their claws and blades painting arcs of defiance against the tide of risen corpses. For a fleeting, impossible moment, they fought not as rivals but as a single animal, a beast with 3 heads. 3 hearts, 3 hungers, the parent's wrath. The parent did not take kindly to defiance. Its ribs slammed shut with a boom like cathedral doors, the moons inside flaring so bright the sky itself blistered. The pendulums of light became chains, whipping outward, lashing across the valley. Wherever they struck, warriors crumbled into dust. Entire squads of dogmen dissolved mid-snarl. Werewolves burst into heaps of fur and bone. Lycans collapsed, their silver scars flaring one last time before going dark. But the pact held. Those who survived lunged harder, fueled not by hope but by spite. Rage sharpened into clarity, strategy welded to instinct. Ritual wove itself into carnage. The parent leaned higher, dragging its full bulk from the ravine. The ground cracked into a canyon, swallowing corpses, swallowing trees, swallowing the past itself. What rose was not a beast, not a god but hunger given shape. Its skull tilted back, and for the first time it howled. The howl shattered the valley, and yet, through the thunder of breaking stone and splitting marrow, the pact howled back. The sacrifice. The Lycan commander knew the truth. His scars flickered dim, silver almost gone. His voice rasped as he barked an order that wasn't a plea, but a demand. Hold the parent, give him time. Dogmen locked together. Forming a wall of living shields, werewolves hurled themselves into the parent's limbs, claws biting into flesh that screamed like metal bent too far. The commander raised his blade to the sky, the silver in his veins burning hotter than fire. And for one last moment, his body was more light than flesh. He leapt, landing between the parent's ribs, plunging his sword into one of the moons inside its chest. The moon screamed, not the parent, the moon itself, and burst into shards of bleeding light. The parent reared back, howling in agony, its claws tearing trenches through the earth. The commander's body disintegrated, silver flames consuming him until nothing remained but the echo of his chant. His sacrifice had cracked the parent open. The last howl the battlefield roared with borrowed courage. Dogmen ripped risen apart with bare jaws. Werewolves tore chunks from the parent's hide. The remaining Lycans drove blades into its open wounds. Every kill was borrowed time. The parent staggered, not beaten, not slain, but wounded in a way it had not been for centuries. Its body collapsed back into the ravine, dragging rubble and corpses with it. The moons inside its chest dimming, flickering, then fading to embers. But hunger never dies as the parent sank. Its voice pulsed one final time through the valley. You have delayed me, not defeated me. The moon is mine still, and I will rise when your children forget fear. The earth closed over the wound. The hum stopped. The fog settled, and silence at last returned. Aftermath the pact did not hold once the parent vanished. Dogmen limped back into the forest, snarling at the wolves they'd once shielded. Werewolves dragged their wounded into the shadows, howls of grief already sharpening into promises of revenge. The Lycans, what few remained, gathered the ashes of their commander, storing them in ritual urns, swearing oaths beneath a dimming moon. The war had no victor, only survivors from the ridge. I lowered my rifle that had never fired. The folio man was gone. The clasp lay open, the pages blank. The valley below looked empty, but I knew better. It wasn't empty, it was waiting, and as the moon dipped behind the trees, I heard it not from the parent, not from the armies, but from the valley itself, a whisper, low and endless. The last howl is never the last, and for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.